So parents need to prepare for some anxiety and some disappointment and pain when it comes to open places. Parenting is not about managing risk out of existence, but helping kids learn how to manage risk. And you can't do that in a risk-free, failure-free environment. Let me pray before I start. Heavenly Father, thank you for all that has been already accomplished today, and I pray that during this next talk that there'll be something that's said that will enrich and help the men who are here. In Christ's name, amen. So fathers, what's the objective? What's the objective? You should probably begin by admitting that there are several objectives and that those objectives can be prioritized. Rather than try to make an ordered list, I'm just going to lump them into three groups when it comes to being a father. There are first-order objectives, secondary ones, and tertiary. Now, considering the nature of the audience I'm addressing, I suspect we're pretty much on the same page when it comes to the first, and that is passing on the faith. That's objective number one. We should raise our children in the new covenant, and this includes a number of things that we should encourage: knowledge of God, attendance upon divine worship and the ordinary means of grace, observing the law, pursuing holiness, developing habits of personal devotion such as prayer and Bible reading, and submitting to the lordship of Christ in all things. We're working at all of those things, and those are first-order matters. They fit into that first lump, that first category. And this largely sums up the teaching on fatherhood that I've heard in Christian circles. Lots of good instruction on how to pray with and for your kids, how to conduct family worship, and even some rudimentary pedagogy. And that's great. But if your kid loves the Lord but remains single and without a livelihood at 32, have you done your job as a father? I think you know where I'm going with this. And is he in any position to pass on the covenant himself? Doesn't that presume that Johnny has a household of his own? There are a whole array of things we want our kids to do that don't seem to fit cleanly into the first lump. Those are law and gospel things, and there are good reasons not to raise other things to that level. What are some of those things, though, that don't rise to that level? How about your vocation, or habits conducive to success, or prudential judgment, which is one of the cardinal virtues, or even physical exercise? How about financial management, or how to invest your savings, or whom to marry? Those are all important things. They're not law and gospel things, but they're not chopped liver. And while we don't want to bind the conscience when it comes to those things, does that mean those are matters of indifference, that they don't matter at all? If those things truly are matters of indifference, when it comes to our boys anyway, let's not complain when they turn to Joe Rogan, or Jordan Peterson, or Jocko Willink, when they want answers. But is the faith indifferent to what constitutes most of our time? I think we can grasp the horns of this apparent dilemma by recalling that law and gospel do not exhaust the Scriptures. There's something else: wisdom. But when it comes to these matters, how can we wisely discuss them? I like to propose a further classification. Secondary matters could be described as adult stuff, or adulting. I don't know if you've heard of that, but apparently it's a thing. I wasn't the person to turn a noun into a verb, but that's a word that's being thrown around a lot, or at least it was a year or two ago. Now, adulting is premised on the truth that adults should be capable of doing certain things. The adulting phenomenon is fascinating because it demonstrates that there is a group of grown-up people out there who are not capable of doing adult stuff. I read a New York Post article which was entitled, "Adulting Classes Prove Millennials' Nitwit Parents Are to Blame." It was published by a guy named Kyle Smith in 2017. Now, the opening sentence of the article gives you a sense of what we're dealing with here. Quote, "For a few years now, evidence has been accumulating that millennials contain within them a weird combination of grandiosity and an inability to leave the house. They're self-absorbed and global thinking, smug and terrified." End of quote. The article goes on to describe an adulting school that psychotherapist Rachel Weinstein and elementary school teacher Katie Brunell started. It is pitched to prospective students with these words: "We know that you're sick of feeling like you're pretending to be grown up, and that someone is going to realize that you don't know expletive about what you're supposed to know." The entrance to the school begins with an adulting quiz, which is actually more a series of statements that you answer yes or no to than a quiz. But here are a few of the questions. First question: I know how much money I have and how to access it. I mean, that's pretty basic. Number 2, I'm comfortable following recipes. Number 3, I know when to use which form of correspondence. Why isn't that employer responding to my texts? In other words. Now, classes begin at $19.99. And I wish I could say that this doesn't apply to Christian young adults, but sometimes it does. It even applies to homeschooling and classical schooling families. In fact, I have friends who are successful entrepreneurs with multi-million-dollar businesses, and they tell me that many of the young men from homeschooling and classical schooling backgrounds who apply for work in their companies are not qualified. They're not qualified because they're mentally and physically soft. They're not adults yet, and they won't hire them. With all this in mind, and while I'm sympathetic to the aims of the adulting school, I wonder if a school shouldn't be directed at fathers and mothers if they're the true nitwits. So welcome to my school for raising adults who don't need adulting classes. Now, before I jump into this, I need to say a couple of things. First, what I'm about to describe is an art, not a science. If you're looking for laws which lead to inevitable outcomes, in other words, techniques that are indifferent to context or the character of your child, I'm not your guy. An artist works with the materials on hand. In this case, your children and your household. And although you should have an ideal in mind, you should also have an eye for and a feel for how that ideal might best be embodied by a particular child. The thing about an ideal, say personal responsibility, is it is universally applicable. But the peculiarities or the particularities of your child, his or her weaknesses and strengths, gifts, interests, all those things should be kept in mind. How to encourage personal responsibility with that child is where the art comes in. This means that there can't be any simple lists of do's and don'ts, no surefire techniques, as I noted. There will be exceptions and qualifications that will need to be made regarding everything that I'm about to say. Now, I have 3 grown children, and I shared a photograph on Slack from my daughter's wedding. So the taller guy is my oldest son, the other guy that's really broad is my second son, and then my daughter is the one who's laughing and holding in the wedding dress. Anyway, they're all doing great. They have households of their own. My oldest son owns his home and is married and has a daughter and a second daughter on the way. She should be here this month, the second daughter, and I'll be heading out to be with them before too long. My second son lives in the Hartford area in Connecticut. He actually is the guy who manages our investment real estate back there. He's married, owns his house. He's the lead He's the lead man on the floor for a pretty significant steel firm, and he's only 26. He's gone from basically entry level to being the top guy in his department in that short time. There are about 300 guys who work in that company. He's very accomplished with his hands. He actually forged the wedding rings that he and his wife wear. You remember that episode of Parks and Recreation when Ron Swanson, pulls the sconce off the wall? And my second son actually did that in our garage with gold. But anyway, then my daughter, she just was married back in December, and now she's expecting her first child. And anyway, so you can see that, and I mentioned my second son has a daughter too. So that's where things stand. They're all doing very well. Now, their achievements are their own. I don't take credit for them. But that's where the art comes in. There's an art to helping your children take responsibility for themselves. That's the trick. How do you get your kids to take responsibility for themselves? When it comes to raising an adult, what are you looking for? Here's the ideal that I always kept in mind. I want children who can exercise good judgment. I was aiming for the first of the cardinal virtues, in other words. I was aiming for prudence. And there are good reasons for this, and I'll get into those over the course of my talk. But when it comes to our household, all three of our kids work for us in different family enterprises, even though we're spread out the way we are. And that is because they're actually very gifted. And it's not just make work. It's not just, it's because he's my son that I want him to do this, or she's my daughter, I want her to do this. They're actually the best people that I could find. And that's what you want. So a different way to put this is this. I want my children to grow up into people who can live without me. In circles that I've circulated in over the last few years, I've observed a couple of things that have troubled me. First, some parents believe, or appear to believe, that their children will reach some vaguely defined age of accountability and poof, a miracle will happen. The child will be a responsible adult. Second, and I actually see this more often, other parents look like they never intend to let go. Whether it's a domineering style that leaves no room for a child to practice independent judgment, or a helicopter approach that never lets Johnny out of sight and intervenes at the first sign of trouble. In either case, because children are not free to fail, they fail to grow up into the kind of people who can exercise good judgment. That, by the way, is one of the things that I intend to talk about, freedom to fail. But it will be the second thing I want to talk about, because the first is honing the edge. Everyone has an edge. We're born with one. It's where you end and other people begin. It's also where other people end and you begin. The second tablet of the law, in the Ten Commandments, largely deals with the edges. The don'ts of the Ten Commandments are intended to reinforce the boundaries between you and other people. Their lives, their stuff, and so forth belong to them. You have no right to those things. This implies, though, something that is sometimes forgotten. That means no one has a right to your life or your stuff. I've seen times when the limits have only been emphasized when it comes to not taking what doesn't belong to you. But no mention is made of that other people have no right to your stuff. The reason that we tend to approach the matter this way is because, frankly, our kids are born tyrants. And they need to learn the first lesson first. But in the process, parents get into the habit of violating the space of their kids so frequently, without justification. And while that's often necessary, over time, Johnny becomes soft, permeable, and dependent. In the end, Johnny can't stand up by himself, let alone stand up for himself. So here's a controversial thought. If we want children who can take care of themselves as well as exercise a prudent agency in the world, we will need to hone the edge. Honing the edge means sharpening the edge so that violating the edge will hurt. Now, someone raised the Sermon on the Mount once with me when I mentioned this, noting that Jesus told us not to resist an evil person. And while Jesus said many difficult things to accept, I'm pretty confident that he wasn't condemning women for resisting rapists. In the case of my daughter, not only do I want her to resist, I want her to scratch and scream when someone tries to harm her. And if I'm onto something here, I think this applies to resisting bullies in the playground, or at work, or in the government. Now, I'm not interested in promoting a quarrelsome spirit. That's not what this is about, or edginess. You know, many of the people who look edgy are not edgy. They're just soft. They just want to look like they're not. What Johnny needs is the conviction that he has an edge and that he's responsible for maintaining it and taking care of what's inside it. Now, intact blue-collar families seem to be better at encouraging this than white-collar families. Ironically, upper-middle-class families tend to discourage it, particularly with the boys. Paradoxically, they encourage their girls, their daughters, to lean in, to be assertive. But the boys must be nice. But girls, they're supposed to be pushy. Boys are actively told that standing up for themselves is morally wrong and that they should rely on authority figures to take care of them. But in the real world, sometimes no one's in charge. Have you noticed that? There's no authority figure in sight, or the authorities can't be trusted. What then? You have to stand up for yourself. Learning to do that is an art, and it is an art that is best learned by imitation. Here's a question. Have your children ever seen you stand up to someone? Or seen you refuse to be pushed around or intimidated? If so, you've probably planted a seed that might spring up someday and bear fruit. So where is all this leading? Here, taking care of yourself and not being taken advantage of go together. Personal responsibility includes both. Those things can be partly learned through programs like martial arts training schools and so forth, but I think they're best learned in the daily round of life. And one of the ways that we can hone the edges of our children is by talking to them about their edges and honoring them ourselves in as much as parents should. And how much should we honor those edges? Remember what I just mentioned a moment ago about art. Now let me get to freedom to fail. As a father, I was first introduced to failure-free zones in T-ball. I was a T-ball coach on Cape Cod. By the way, Rory, it's pronounced Barnstable, the town. It's a town on Cape Cod. I used to live there. But anyway, I'm just so you know. But so safe spaces, were established, and T-ball was one of those safe spaces. But as I've grown older, I've noticed that they're springing up all over the place. I don't know if you've noticed this. Schools, colleges, even businesses, especially with favored minority groups, they need their safe spaces. So things have come a long way since I was a kid. My parents were members of the me generation. They perfected the art of parental neglect. Long before there were latchkey kids, I was completely unsupervised and on my own. And we didn't have a thing called free-range parenting. It was just parents were preoccupied. By the time I was 10 years old, I was pretty much on my own. I had gotten into several playground fights, was nearly killed a couple of times, once in a treehouse, another jumping a bike, and I committed several crimes with my buddies. And while I'm not saying that you should encourage any of those things, I did learn some important things that have served me well. I'd like to reflect on those with you a little bit. One is I learned situational awareness. I learned to observe where I was and with whom, and that's proven helpful. And it's been helpful because it's helped me keep my head in tight spots. Have you ever been mugged at machete point? I have. Have you ever been in a gang fight with about 100 kids in the inner city of Boston? I mean, right in the middle of it? I have. I've been in a lot of weird places and seen a lot of weird stuff, but I've been able to keep my head because as a kid, I had to keep my head. Kind of learned it the hard way. I also learned to think well on my feet. I've learned to improvise. Because no one was around to tell me what to do, I had to learn how to think fast and talk fast. And then there's risk tolerance. I'd like to reflect with you on that. When no one guarantees your safety, you develop an intuition for your odds. This is important to know because sometimes you need to run, as well as what to run to, because rashness can kill you, but so can indecision. With all those things in mind, you might be wondering what parents are good for. A great deal, actually. There are things I missed out on because I didn't have parental guidance. My academic performance was poor. I hated 8th grade so much I took it twice, largely because I just didn't bother going to school. And there were things that I wish that I'd had a father to introduce me to. Hunting, for instance. Now, safe spaces aren't bad. It's just they aren't good for developing personal responsibility. But how do we have safe spaces and open places? Well, one of the things we need to do is keep them separate. That's how. And we should encourage movement between the two. Open places are by nature unstructured and unsupervised. And they are often literally outside. They're also media-free and even task-free. You can learn a great deal when you're bored. I learned a great deal that wasn't so good to know, but I also learned a great deal that was good, has been good to know. So parents need to prepare for some anxiety and some disappointment and pain when it comes to open places. And the reason is this: parenting is not about managing risk out of existence, but helping kids learn how to manage risk. And you can't do that in a risk-free, failure-free environment. The paradox is where there is risk, there is also a potential for reward. And often the greater the risk, the greater the possible reward or failure. And that's why we can't be a genuine success or have genuine success without the genuine possibility for failure. And that's why freedom to fail is a good thing. Now, when it comes to being an advocate for freedom to fail in the home, very often it's the father who has to speak up for it. I remember my wife, like any good mother, wants her children to survive, right? And so she tended to be the advocate for safety. Safety first. I remember when my oldest son was small, my wife was into constructive playthings. You know the philosophy. Nothing that would sort of inspire or sort of allude to any kind of violent activity. And, we consequently didn't have any toy guns in the house. And I got to a certain point where I noticed my oldest son had an interest in that sort of thing, and I said, I'm going to get him a toy gun. She, of course, was very concerned about this. After all, toy gun, next thing you know, you're shooting up schools. So there's that kind of mindset. But anyway, we had this big set of Lego blocks, and we didn't watch much television or anything. It wasn't as though he saw, like Clint Eastwood on television and got inspiration or something like that. But he managed to build the biggest gun you could possibly make with his Lego blocks. And he came out into the living room and shot my wife. I just kind of looked over her and smiled and said, "You give up yet?" Then I went out and got him a gun. With my second son, I remember there was a point where he demonstrated a real interest in making things and doing things with his hands, and I said, it's time for him to get a pocket knife. And I think he was maybe 7 or 8 years old or something like that at the time. And of course, my wife was concerned he was going to cut himself. And I said, of course, that's how he learns, that it's sharp. And so I got him a pocket knife, and sure enough, he cut his hands up, and it was just a mess. But he learned how to handle a knife, and he's done quite well with dangerous tools ever since. He almost burned the house down one time, but he's done well. Now, I want to talk a little bit about internalizing standards at this point, because this is where the rubber really meets the road. There are two things to note about standards. First, standards begin on the outside and move to the inside. They're out there initially, though, and they're real whether we like them or not. But so long as they're outside us, we need other people to apply them to us. And very often we resent and resist this. So long as this is the case, we can't exercise good judgment so much as just live under the judgment of somebody else. But if we internalize the standards, then there is a shift from what was outside to the inside. And that's what we want to see happen. But how? How does that happen? I think that most parents apply standards in the hope that some mysterious process will occur in which the standards sink in. In the meantime, they resort to carrots and sticks. And while we must use carrots and sticks, there is a discernible lowering of returns as you do so. Have you noticed this? Today, we don't resort to sticks as much as people did in the past. In the past, people would say things like, "Learn your multiplication table, Johnny, or there's no porridge for you." Today, though, instead of relying on the heavy hand, we rely too heavily on praise. We believe that, the good vibes school of education will get the job done. Now, that's closely related to the self-esteem cult. And it sounds something like this: "That's the most awesome crayon drawing I've ever seen, Johnny." What is it? The problem with this approach is obviously grade inflation. If the drawing is awesome, what do you say when the drawing is better? Super awesome? Awesome, awesome, awesome? Eventually you run out of superlatives, but you drain them of value at the same time. That's how inflation works. The same problem occurs when we turn too quickly to the stick. When all you know how to do is spank, every offense is a spanking offense. But spanking should be the nuclear option, not the first and only option. And in this case, overuse deflates the significance of the punishment and often builds resistance and resentment, and you don't want to go there. Instead, don't we want kids to do good work for the satisfaction of doing good work, whether or not someone's there to praise them for it? The task then, if I may say so, is not so much as implant the standard in the kid as encourage the kid to reach out and take the standard and pull it into himself. By the way, that's what the word educate literally means. It means to draw out. For this, the Socratic method can really work well. And that is something that's accomplished, the Socratic method, through conversation. What you want to see in this conversation is the internalization of the standards, so that Johnny can question himself and apply good standards to his own work without somebody else telling him to do so. So let's return to Johnny's crayon drawing for a second. Instead of saying, "Awesome," you can lead with the question, "What did you draw?" Then let Johnny tell you. Encourage him to describe it in detail. As he does, reserve your praise for the best parts. And generally, you won't need to say anything about the parts that aren't as good. Often, but not always, the child will notice what you've not said as much as what you've said. If Johnny wants to draw you out, turn it around and see if you can get Johnny to judge his own work. Now, I didn't have a very good father, as you probably have been able to conclude or infer from what I've said. But I remember my father did one thing, and it might have been just because he was too, preoccupied to apply himself to the task, but it was really helpful. I had done something to torment my sister, I'm sure, and it was time for some discipline. But rather than just simply apply discipline to me, my father asked me a question, and that question was, "What punishment do you think you deserve?" And then he sent me back to my room to think about it, promising that if it wasn't adequate, he would think of something himself. So what that did is it forced me to really kind of weigh it out. What did I do? Why was it wrong? What kind of punishment should I receive for this? And then I came and I made I pronounced judgment on myself. And my father looked at me and said, that was harder than I was going to do. It was more painful than I was going to say that it deserved, but so be it. That's your punishment. But you see, the process here, and this was the genius of it, is he forced me to think about it, to internalize it, to consider the standard, look at my own behavior, and to pronounce judgment on myself. So, when we have that in mind, what we're not interested so much in is, with our kids, a longing for praise, so much as we are interested in the ability to discern good work. When the work is good, taking the measure of the child, say so. When it isn't, very often silence would do. And generally speaking, the love of learning, when it comes to an interest, a subject of interest to your child, and good work, those things just naturally go together. Now, this has been a very brief talk, and the reason it's so brief is it's lunchtime. But I'd be happy to talk about, this sort of thing, this matter of working with your kids and raising adults in more detail in the course of personal conversation.